Hey Patreon viewers, Matt Easton here, and I'm actually kind of on a roll. I've been making some videos today, so good news is I'm feeling, you might be able to hear just from my voice actually, I'm feeling quite a lot better. I finally feel like I've kicked that flu into touch and I'm not coughing all over the place anymore. I thought I'd give you a little behind the scenes to a video that I'm just about to put out. In fact, depending on how you view things, what your viewing habits are, you might actually see the public video before you see this video. But it's a video talking about double-ended spears for a very reason that some of you will have already guessed as you're watching this video, and it's because of the latest episode of Game of Thrones. Now, obviously, therefore, spoiler alert, I haven't spoiled you yet because you don't know why I'm talking about a double-ended spear, but if you're not up to date with Game of Thrones, then probably don't watch on, I'm afraid, because I might accidentally spoil you some more. Right, so assuming you're still with me at this point, you're up to date with Game of Thrones, or you just don't care about Game of Thrones, you don't mind being spoiled, whatever. So, Arya's double-ended spear. So we saw in episode 2, season 8, final season of Game of Thrones, that Arya has had a double-ended spear made for her with dragon glass tips at both ends. And I've just made a video basically talking about, actually I think that's really great. I think it's the perfect weapon for her. It's a good weapon. I like everything about it, okay? No criticisms at all, really. But what I thought I'd do is, I think I have shown this spear in previous videos, but I thought I'd just talk a little bit about it to you on the private channel, as it were, for Patreon viewers. And so this is a very specific type of Sudanese spear. And actually, although it's got a rather nice hand-forged and rather long, almost assegai-like, and I'll talk about assegais and Zulu spears in a second, which aren't actually assegais, they're ikloas, but I'll explain. A rather nice, big, long, almost partisan-like head, but actually one of the most interesting things about this type of spear is the butt end. So you will see that the butt, in fact, if I get it really, really close and get it focused in there, you can see it's made of a coil of iron, literally a strip of iron that curls all the way up and is wrapped around, forged around the wooden shaft. And these, I mean, I love these. We know that there's some ancient world, some Greek and other classical world spears that had butt caps on them, that had essentially pommels on them. Certainly some hoplite types of spears actually had almost a flanged and spiked, almost mace-like back end, and that was obviously to provide some degree of counterbalance. Now, with a spear with a head of that size, if it didn't have this iron at the back, you would never get a point of balance, in other words, where to grip or potentially throw. It's not really a throwing spear. You'd never get a balance point that far back from the head. That doesn't mean that you have to hold it there only, of course, because spears are relatively light for their size. So whilst that might be the perfect balance point, it means that I could hold it back there, and now, much like a sword, my hand's only about 10 inches from the balance point, so it still feels very wieldy and nimble, but I've got a hell of a lot of this spear in front of my hand. And what's interesting is, although this is a short spear, only comes up to about the middle of my chest, although this is a short spear, because of that pommel end where I can hold it, it now means I've got that much weapon, which is what, about maybe 3 feet, roughly 36 inches in front of my hand. I've got 3 feet of weapon in front of my hand, and if I didn't have that, I'd have to have more than 3 feet, because remember, if there was no head or balance on the back, I'd have to have more length at the back than the front to have that as a natural holding point. So most spears without a back pommel end would have to be much, much longer weapons. And if they weren't, then I'd have to hold them near the front and wouldn't have as much reach. So sticking a pommel on I mean, it's the same thing as swords, really. Sticking a pommel on a spear is actually a really, really great idea. Yes, it does increase the overall weight of the weapon, but this is still super, super light. I mean, it's still lighter than most sabres are. It's still a super light weapon to carry around. And it's a great weapon. You've got great reach with it. Now, I mentioned assegais, as they're commonly called, or ikluas. First of all, my understanding is that the assegai is actually the Zulu throwing spear, and the iklua is actually the short stabbing spear that they're famous for using. Now, one way that they generally differ, not always, but will generally differ from this spear, is you'll notice this spearhead, which is from the Sudan. Have I mentioned that already? So this is a dervish, it's a Mahdist dervish spear, perhaps from the 1880s or 1890s, probably brought back from one of the British Army's campaigns in the Sudan War, of which started in about 1882, actually initially with Egypt fighting the Mahdist forces. If you don't know, incidentally, I have a tendency to assume people know the same about the same bits of history as I do, but if you're not kind of familiar with this period of history, there was a guy called the Mahdi, known in Britain in British newspapers as the Mad Mahdi, who was essentially an Islamic fundamentalist, and he essentially riled up lots of different tribes, formed them into a big army, the Mahdist forces under the Mahdi, and went on a campaign, essentially a crusade, a kind of religiously fueled, if not necessarily only religious. It wasn't a religious war only, although it definitely used religion to fuel it, on all of the area around the Sudan, essentially. And it spread all the way to kind of Ethiopia. Some elements of it almost spread down to the Congo, and it went all the way to Egypt and into Egypt. And so in 1882, or in the 1880s, Egypt was under quite a lot of threat from this expanding Mahdist movement, which I think started in the 1870s. And to cut a long story short, Egypt ended up becoming a British protectorate. I don't think officially ever part of the British Empire, but kind of unofficially. And then Gordon of Khartoum was killed in 1884, I think. British forces went in to essentially avenge his death. He was the governor of Khartoum, and the Mahdist forces killed him in an uprising. And then the British Army spent basically the next 15 years pretty much policing and soldiering around that area. As a result, lots of Sudanese weapons like these and like the famous Cascara sword found their way back to Britain, brought back as souvenirs after things like the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, where thousands of Mahdist fighters were killed in battle. Many of them, well, most of them just gunned down by rifles, some killed by machine guns, very few in hand-to-hand combat because the firearm disparity was so stark by 1898. And so there were thousands of dead people with weapons, and lots of soldiers went around, picked up these weapons and brought them back. So that's how so many of these have ended up in antique shops in Britain. Thankfully for modern collectors, but obviously not very nice for the people that originally carried them. And these, going back to the Zulu spear, so the Zulu Iklua has a similar head to this. It's quite a long head, almost short sword-like in fairness in its length. I mean, you could almost hack off the shaft and use that as a large dagger. Some of them are really, really big, and some of them are bigger than this, and some of them are broader. But the main way that they differ, the South African Zulu spears from these, in this case, Northeast African spear, is this has a socket, much like European spears almost always do. It's a split socket, so this is actually very similar to a spearhead you'd find in an Anglo-Saxon or Viking or Frankish grave from the 7th century. Obviously not Viking 7th century, but if you went forward to the 8th or 9th century for Viking. So in the so-called migration era and into the Viking era, spear tips were there were certain types of spear tips that were very, very similar to these 19th century Sudanese ones. Zulu spears usually have, instead of a socket, they usually have a tang, believe it or not. Now, a tang is a lot easier to make than a socket. I don't really know why the Zulus made tangs instead of sockets. I don't know if it was to do with their technical knowledge, or if there was some mechanical reason that they preferred tangs to sockets, or if it was related to the wood they were using. But essentially they usually have a tang which goes down into a drilled hole in the socket, and then a calf tail, of essentially leather, is shrunk around that part of the shaft to hold everything together so it can't split and come apart. So, you know, a nice design, a different engineering solution to solve the issue of how do you connect the head to the shaft. Anyway, there we go. A little bit of behind the scenes on this particular spear and spears in general. And if you ever come across an antique spear and it has this coiled iron at the back end, it is almost certainly dervish bringback. It's almost certainly Sudanese, late 19th century. But just to complicate things, you do get, that is also a Sudanese spear, but it's on a replacement shaft. So it doesn't have the original coil of iron at the back end. So you do get Sudanese dervish spears which don't have this at the back for a number of reasons. They didn't all have this originally, and many of them have not on the original shafts. They've had replacement shafts put on in the last 100 and however many years, 140, 130 years. So there we go. Anyway, Sudanese spears, and this relates to Game of Thrones as well. And I will see you really soon for another video. Cheers for watching, folks.